Let me ask you something. If a country supports Hamas, sells weapons to Pakistan, gives shelter to multiple global terror outfits, and profits off global conflicts, would you still call it a liberal Muslim democracy? Because that's exactly what Turkey is doing, and most people have no idea. Let me show you how deep this really goes. Turkey's President Erdoğan has been in power for over 22 years. He controls Turkey's courts, media, and army. And to hold on to that power, he's turned Turkey into a launchpad for radical Islamism. See, back in 2011, Erdogan publicly said Hamas is not a terror group but a legitimate political party. Soon after, senior Hamas leader Saleh al-Aruri moved to Turkey and began operating from there. Turkey became Hamas's safe haven. Logistics, fundraising, and radicalization all flourished. In 2013, Turkey even gave Hamas $300 million in funding. Today, Istanbul is a base for Hamas recruiters radicalize young Turks into jihad. But President Erdogan didn't stop there. He started using terror as a tool for diplomacy. He invested in Turkey's defense exports, even at the cost of his own economy. Inflation in Turkey stands at 35% and last year 68%. Yet, he continues debt funding terrorism in arms. Guess who owns the company that makes the Bayraktar drones? His own son-in-law, Selçuk Bayraktar, married to Sumaya Erdogan, his daughter. The same drones that were used by the Pakistani army and establishment against India in Operation Sindoor. While Erdogan and his own party AKP called for boycotting Israel in 2023, his eldest son Burak Erdogan was found profiting off trade with Israel through his shipping firm MB Denizcilik, in which many of Erdogan's party's elites were also involved. Corruption, hypocrisy, terror profiteering, all rolled into one regime. And while Turkey plays middlemen in Russia and Ukraine, Hamas, Israel, and other peace talks and even hosting US Hamas back channels, it does so because it arms at least one side of the conflict heavily. And the West knows that, and it knows Turkey's true influence and patronage on these terror groups. Their so-called humanitarian charity, IHH, is flagged by US intel for links to Al-Qaeda and financially acting as a money launderer and fundraiser for Hamas and other jihadist organizations. This isn't a coincidence. This is a statecraft model. Destabilize the region, arm the chaos, and then sell peace and power broking. So no, Turkey is not the peaceful, progressive country you think it is. It is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Behind the cool vibe and baklavas lies a much sinister reality.
The most powerful country in the Middle East is now Turkey. This is the one post I'm going to make where I don't stress how awful Erdogan and the Turkish government has been to the Kurds. Bear with me. Iran was one of the most powerful countries, but they've been decimated by their opponent. And maybe Iran's opponent would defeat Turkey eventually in its tit-for-tat battle. Turkey has something that Iran's opponent doesn't. NATO membership. 32 of the most powerful countries on the planet coordinating and working together. No country can stand against it. Now, don't get me wrong about Egypt. You have the largest army, you have the largest air force around in the area, but your tech is quite obsolete compared to Turkey because they have the most recent NATO equipment. They have a standing army of about 445,000 troops. Their air force is about 1,226 fighter jets, and they have about 1,421 advanced military drones because Turkey is one of the largest drone producers in NATO, which means that in all of NATO, Turkey has the second largest army, the second largest drone fleet, and the second largest air force underneath the United States. Now, I understand not all of this equipment is modern, but it is much more modern than any other country in the Middle East, aside from, most likely, Iran's opponent. How could I forget? Turkey boasts of about 1,000 advanced ballistic missiles, but they want to up that number, so they are aiming to create their own, with medium and long-range missile production being aimed for by 2026. So now, Turkey is accelerating its already massive military capabilities. One thing Turkey has that no other country in the Middle East possesses is experience with a coordinated effort with the world's largest alliance. They are one of the most active participating nations in any NATO operation. What this means for the Middle East, now that Iran is no longer a major power, is that a NATO entity can hold sway over this entire region. And the president of this large NATO entity, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, has played a very brilliant diplomatic game of condemning Iran's opponent, but secretly supporting them. While condemning Iran's opponent for a long time, he developed a great deal of street cred and some kind of cordial relationship with Iran. But his recent move into liberating Syria, or at least helping facilitate that liberation, means that Iran lost a major corridor and a munitions producer from that regime fleeing. And remember, not only did Turkey deprive Iran of their crucial corridor in Syria, they also gave Iran's enemy a little chunk of land, and they expanded their territory. So I would pay little to no attention to what President Erdoğan says, but only what he's doing. He knows where his bread is buttered. As a result, Turkey is the new sheriff in town. It also means that the country of Turkey gets to expand its influence in all of Africa, because it actually is a huge military influencer in over half of the continent. Despite my feelings about Erdogan's regime, he is one of the few counters to unfettered Russian, Chinese, and Iranian influence in this continent. No matter how the conflict between Iran and their opponent ends, Turkey will be the mediator of this, even though Russia really wants to be the one to do it. Over the past 8 years, a great deal of agreements and talks that have occurred between vital world powers have taken place in Turkey, for good reason. Even though Turkey is a part of NATO and they do seek ascension into the EU, they are not fully compliant with Western interests, which isn't always well for the Middle East and North Africa, so they represent a healthy voice of opposition. Remember what I said in the beginning of this post. If Iran is no longer a major strategic threat, and there is some kind of relative peace in the Middle East, and Turkey is the pretty much reigning power of the region, guess what? Iran's current opponent has less leverage since there is no longer this major threat of Iran. And maybe any measures taken by Iran's current opponent in the future can be properly brought to question or even sanctioned. It's a major shift for the balance of power in the Middle East. Let's hope that Erdogan or his successor in Turkey do not get too drunk with it. I am the Geo Husar, and keep your eyes on the moves that Turkey is making. Thanks for watching.
1923, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Ataturk founded modern Turkey. He was all about building a secular modern country. No state religion, free primary education, equal rights for women, very progressive for the time. But it was not a democracy. Ataturk's party ruled alone, and he stayed in power as an authoritarian for 15 years until he died. And that set an important precedent that we'll come back to later. In 1950, things changed. Turkey held its first fair election, a new party won, a peaceful transition of power took place, and that was the birth of Turkish democracy. But not for long. Economic crisis hit, and in 1960, 38 young military officers overthrew the elected government, and the prime minister was later executed. And the next 2 decades were full of political violence, chaos, and then another coup in 1980. In 1983, civilian rule finally came back, and things started improving. In the 1990s, Turkey saw a rise of political Islam, an ideology that believed that Turkey's statehood should be rooted in Islamic values, and that it needed to distance itself from the European culture. The tensions kept rising, and finally that question became central in 1996, when a pro-Islamist Prime Minister Erdoğan took power. But 1 year later, the military forced him out. Okay, so there are a couple of themes we're seeing. One is the constant political instability. Another is Turkey's struggle with its own identity. Is it a secular state or one rooted in Islamic values? The third one is Ataturk's legacy. He was a great progressive, but also an authoritarian who didn't let go of power until he died. Compare that to the US, where the first president, George Washington, chose to leave power after 2 terms, setting a democratic norm that was then followed by almost every single president. Not because it was a law, but simply because Washington did it. In Turkey, there was no precedent that leaders had to let go of power, and that left the door open to leaders like Erdogan. In 2002, Erdogan won the election and became prime minister. At first, he looked like a modern reformer, boosting the economy, opening talks with the EU, but after winning again in 2007 and then again in 2011, the warning signs started becoming more obvious. Erdogan wanted to stay in power no matter what. And let me tell you how he did it. In 2014, Erdogan couldn't run for prime minister again because of his party rules. But there was a solution. He became president. Previously, president was a symbolic, politically neutral role, but Erdoğan changed the rules and made himself more powerful than the prime minister. After a failed coup attempt against him in 2016, he went full crackdown. Almost 3,000 judges were arrested, 15,000 education staff were suspended, and the licenses of 21,000 teachers were revoked. And that was a classic authoritarian move. Autocrats like using things like martial law and coup attempts to get rid of opposition, branding them as traitors or threats to the national security. A year after the coup, as a result of a very close referendum, the role of the prime minister was completely abolished, and President Erdoğan gained even more executive powers. But in 2019, something happened that Erdoğan didn't like at all. The opposition took Istanbul. İmamoğlu became mayor through a very decisive local election win. In 2024, he got re-elected with a 12-point margin, and many experts saw him as the only serious challenger for the 2028 presidential race. But then suddenly, on March 18, 2024, Istanbul University declared İmamoğlu's degree invalid. And that matters, because to run for president in Turkey, you legally need a university degree. The next day, he was arrested. Protests in Istanbul were banned, but people came anyway. Students flooded the streets, hundreds of thousands of people showed up in cities all over Turkey.
What is the Turkey that you want?
Democracy, like pure democracy, as everyone wants. Nothing more, nothing else. I just want to live my life. Everyone else thinks the same. No one wants to be here. Everyone wants to be at their home. Working in their homes and supporting their families, etc., etc. But here we are just trying to bring democracy back.
We here because of the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu. But after everyone realized how bad country's situation is,
We're just fed up and we can't take it anymore. So we are here to defend our rights and to protest against the government.
because of a lot of things, we have a lot of problems about our country. Because of the economy, inflation, and because of the justice, because of the femicides.
We are all fed up with it. And after all these things that happened to Ekrem İmamoğlu and all the other political people that are sent to jail.
Turkey's economy, once tipped to repeat the success of South Korea's transformation, is in a rut. The reason is the tough measures needed to rescue the country from the balance of payments crisis it faced 2 years ago. But the arrest this March of Istanbul mayor and star opposition politician Ekrem İmamoğlu made matters worse. It led to mass riots and caused a financial panic which forced the central bank to jack up interest rates again. Around 1,000 domestic companies have filed for bankruptcy so far this year. Foreign and local businesses have reconsidered their investment plans. Real exchange rate appreciation, fueled by inflation outstripping the lira currency's rate of depreciation, has also hurt Turkish exporters. Turks, meanwhile, face a cost of living crisis. These economic doldrums have increased the political risks facing President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. They have drained Erdoğan's popular support, jeopardizing his plans to remain in power, his geopolitical aspirations, and ongoing peace talks with Kurdish militants. Many expect Erdoğan to stand for a third presidential term beyond the 2 terms currently allowed by the constitution. But to do that requires him to forge complicated political alliances. Tough economic times may make that difficult task harder still.
In 2002, Erdoğan won the election and became prime minister. At first, he looked like a modern reformer, boosting the economy, opening talks with the EU, but after winning again in 2007 and then in 2011 again, the warning signs started becoming more obvious. Erdoğan wanted to stay in power no matter what. In 2014, Erdoğan couldn't run for prime minister again because of his party rules. But there was a solution. He became president. Previously, president was a symbolic, politically neutral role. But Erdoğan changed the rules and made himself more powerful than the prime minister. Erdoğan's views were also gradually becoming more Islamist. He expressed his opposition to birth control, claimed that women cannot be treated as equal to men, and said that he didn't recognize LGBT. Then, after a failed coup attempt against him in 2016, he went full crackdown. Almost 3,000 judges were arrested, 15,000 education staff were suspended, and the licenses of 21,000 teachers were revoked. And that was a classic authoritarian move. Autocrats really like using things like martial law or coup attempts to get rid of opposition, branding them as traitors or threats to the national security. security, and then consolidate power. A year after the coup, as a result of a very close referendum, the role of the prime minister was completely abolished, and President Erdoğan gained even more executive power. But in 2019, something happened that Erdoğan didn't like at all. The opposition took Istanbul. İmamoğlu became mayor through a very decisive election win. In 2024, he got re-elected with a 12-point margin, and many experts saw him as the only serious challenger for the 2028 presidential race. But then suddenly, on March 18, 2025, Istanbul University declared İmamoğlu's degree invalid. And that matters because to run for president in Turkey, you legally need a university degree. The next day, he was arrested. Protests in Istanbul were banned, but people came anyway. Students flooded the streets, hundreds of thousands of people showed up in cities all over Turkey.
Would article do this?
This is not the time, Erdogan believes, for me to be seen to be too close to the Palestinians at the expense of my relations with the Israelis. And I think that describes Erdogan's position, in that I have a population to appease, but I don't want to go too far with the Israelis. I have a population to try to keep quiet, and I will do what's necessary to keep them, or do within what I can do to keep them quiet. I'm trying to balance between the anger of my Muslim population, the anger of the Turks, and between my desire to keep good ties with the Israelis. I'm trying to keep the Turks on board with me, who are really angry over Gaza, while ensuring that I can keep the Israelis on board because I need them to help me with the Americans so I can look after my economy. Some Erdogan supporters have said, what do you expect Erdogan to do? One of the largest oil supplies that is going to Israel is through the Ceyhan pipeline that the Azerbaijanis are transporting. It goes through Turkey. Turkey has enough influence over Azerbaijan to tell them we want to stop this oil going towards the Israelis. Erdogan doesn't dare touch it. You know, the same way that we talk about the Arab states, do something, you have power to do so. Erdogan is intentionally trying to avoid using any of that leverage against the Israelis because he fears the repercussions of standing against the Israelis. That they will bring everyone to bear down on Turkey, that Saudi might join them, UAE might join them, etc. He might feel abandoned. The Americans might add to the economic crisis. This is not the time, Erdogan believes, for me to be seen to be too close to the Palestinians at the expense of my relations with the Israelis. Erdogan, if you remember at the beginning, kicked out Hamas very quickly over what happened. Then when he thought negotiations were going really well, he invited Hamas back to Ankara. Then when the negotiations failed, and instead the talk went to how Palestinian Authority might be able to be a peacekeeping force in Gaza, he invited Mahmoud Abbas to the Turkish parliament to give a speech, and a big applause was given to Mahmoud Abbas. The reactionary approach of Erdogan shows there is no clear plan here. There's no proactive plan. As far as Erdogan is concerned, he wants to ride this out as best as possible.
Bu azgın devlet, bu terör devleti eğer durdurulmazsa vaat edilmiş topraklar hezeyanıyla gözünü er ya da geç Anadolu'ya dikecekler. İsrail Gazze'de sadece Filistinlilere saldırmıyor. Bize saldırıyor, bize. Hamas Gazze'de Anadolu'nun ileri hat savunmasını yapıyor. Bunu göremeyecek kadar kör müsünüz?
The problem that we're finding in Gaza is that Erdogan continues to trade with the Israelis until he loses the municipality elections. He loses 10 cities because the Turks punish him. Erdogan, of his own will, doesn't want to suspend trade with the Israelis. He has to be forced by the Turks to do so.
Gazze'yi, Filistin'i bombalayan pilotlar Konya'da eğitildi. O uçakların yakıtı İskenderun'dan gidiyor. O askerlerin, katil askerlerin besini Alanya'dan gidiyor. O askerlerin suyu Manavgat'tan gidiyor. Her türlü gemiyle ticari alışveriş devam ediyor. Zaten 20 milyar dolara çıkmış olan ticaret hacmimizde de birinci sırada demir çelik mamullerin yer alması manidar. Söylemeye dilim varmıyor ama belki o katillerin elindeki silah bile bir şekilde desteğinize gidiyor. Onun için diyorum ki yüreğiniz yetiyorsa gelin burada konuşun, gerçekler konuşuluyor. Onun için arkadaşlar üzülmeyin, gereğini yapın, üzülmeyin, baş kaldırın. Burada tweet atarak, slogan atarak kınamayla devam edeceksiniz. Yoksa Filistin'e sahip çıkmayı da 2053, 2071 içerisine mi bırakacaksınız? Ukrayna'ya İHA gönderirken, Azerbaycan'a SİHA gönderirken Filistin'e dua göndermeyle mi yetineceksiniz? Desteği kesin yeter ama adım atın. Bugünden sonra yapılacak sadece insani yardım, gıda yardımı da asla yeterli değildir. Gıda yardımı yapmak demek aç ölmeyin demektir. Size düşen desteği kesmek, burada ciddi, samimi adım atmak.
Is Turkey really supporting Gaza like they say? Or are they also helping Israel? Let me break it down. Israel gets around 40% of its oil from Azerbaijan. That oil travels through pipelines directly through Turkey, and without that oil, Israel's war in Gaza wouldn't be possible. So people are asking if Turkey supports Gaza, why let Israel get its oil? Some say Turkey is scared of upsetting Israel or Azerbaijan, but that doesn't add up. Turkey already cut trade and ended relations with Israel. The real reason, money. Turkey makes billions letting that oil pass through. At the same time, Turkey is also one of Gaza's top aid providers, sending over 100,000 tons of supplies, way more than countries like the UK. So Turkey says one thing in public, but behind the scenes, they might be doing the opposite.
Erdogan, I think, in my opinion, dreams of a sultan-esque state. And what's interesting is that often you'll find, even amongst Turkish nationalists, there is a view that large parts of Syria, in their opinion, belongs to Turkey. Large parts of Iraq belong to Turkey. There was an agreement signed between Turkey and Syria that used to allow the Turkish regime to, without asking permission from Damascus, to march in within 30, 40 kilometers. And it was a sign of the Turks saying that this is our territory anyway, so we're allowed to march in as we wish. Erdogan believes that historically the road to power goes through Syria, then goes through Egypt, and that's the historical Ottoman areas. I'm not falling into the trope of neo-Ottoman, but Erdogan, when you look at his rhetoric, when you look at what he did with Hagia Sophia, when you look at the masajid that he built, the shows that he commissioned, Ertuğrul, Alp Arslan, the Fatih Sultan Mehmet shows and these others, it's clear that in Erdogan's socio-historical memory, his vision for what Turkey looks like is a Muslim Turkey that restores its influence over those areas that it used to rule in the Muslim world itself.
So Ataturk, after the Ottoman Empire was disassembled, he decided okay, there's no more Ottoman Empire, we're now Turkey, and then he decided, I'm going to modernize it in my own image. And I'm going to take Turkey and make it into this new thing. I'm going to change the letters it uses to write its language. I'm going to change the language. Ataturk ordered that Turkish be purged of its Arabic and Persian words. And it had a lot of Arabic and Persian. And then they switched the alphabet from Arabic alphabet to the Latin alphabet. So Turks today can't read any of their literature that's more than 100 years old because, first of all, the letters are unrecognizable to them. But even if they get past that and learn the Arabic letters, they have to now learn these Arabic and Persian words that have been deleted from their language. Iran has the glory of being one of the only states on the planet to not get colonized by Europe. There aren't many, right? Liberia is one of them. Thailand did not get conquered by a European state. Japan did not get conquered. The Ottoman Empire definitely got carved up like a Thanksgiving Day turkey, pun intended, but Turkey effectively avoided the European conquest. And then Persia, that's it.
Turkey claims it will stabilize the situation in Syria.
Turkey?
Yeah. Israel doesn't want Turkey to influence Syria. What do you think? Do you think Turkey's influence in Syria can actually make it a better, more peaceful country, or vice versa?
Well, I have great relations with a man named Erdoğan. Have you heard of him? And I happen to like him, and he likes me, and I know the press will get very angry. He likes Erdoğan, but I do, and he likes me, and we've never had a problem, and we've gone through a lot, and we've never had a problem. We've always got We, as you remember, we got our minister back from Turkey. You remember that? And this was a big deal at the time. And we got him back. And I told the prime minister, I said, just, Bibi, if you have a problem with Turkey, I really think I'm going to be able to work it out. You know, I have a very, very good relationship with Turkey and with their leader. And I think we'll be able to work it out. So I hope that's not going to be a problem. I don't think it will be a problem. Now, with that being said, I believe it was Turkey, and I said that to him. I said it. I said, congratulations. You've done what nobody's been able to do in 2,000 years. You've taken over Syria with different names, but same thing. I said, you've taken it over. He's taken it over through surrogates. He goes, no, it was not me. I said, it was you. But that's okay. You don't have to say, well, sort of maybe was me. Okay. But what he did, look, he's a tough guy and he's very smart. And he did something that nobody was able to do. You know, you got to hand it to him. Any problem that you have with Turkey, I think I can solve. I mean, as long as you're reasonable. You have to be reasonable. We have to be reasonable. Thank you very much.
But people believe about the situation. They believe that Russia's an authoritarian state. And Judge, let me emphasize in this, the way this is presented to the average person, not just in the United States, but around the world, this is sold as some sort of struggle for freedom. This is based in some sort of ideology. We're here for freedom and democracy. And that's a bunch of crap. That's a lie. This is about money. This is about the United States, for example, getting rid of the Nord Stream pipeline so Europe has to buy our natural gas. They don't want Russia selling that cheap natural gas to them because that hurts our ability to make money. Why do we want Russia? Russia's got all these natural resources. They shouldn't have all those. How about Syria? Well, Syria's got plans in place that there were going to be, there's hopes to build 2 pipelines. One pipeline would come out of Iran, go across Iraq through Syria, and then have an oil terminal there in Syria where oil could be picked up from the Mediterranean and shipped all over. Oh, the West can't have that. So that's why we're busy trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Get him out of the way so we can get a friendly ruler in there. And then guess what? This oil pipeline will come out of Qatar. It'll go up through Saudi Arabia. It'll cross Jordan. It'll then go through Syria. And gee, where does it end up? Oh my God, it'll end up in Turkey. And so Turkey winds up being the economic benefactor at that. That's what this is all about. This is about money. This isn't about Islam versus Christianity. This isn't about freedom versus authoritarianism. Those are all deep state lies. It is the money. Follow the money.
The SCO is, in our opinion, the current representative of our ancient relations. That's why we attach importance to further improve our relations with the organization. The dialogue partnership status we've had for the past decade has been a window that opens to Asia.
Turkey, which is part of NATO, is also a dialogue partner of the SCO. But could Ankara become a full-fledged member in the future?
President Erdoğan of Turkey revealed that the Turkish government has made an application to join BRICS. I can understand why they would want to do that, Professor Sachs, but can they be in BRICS and NATO at the same time?
Well, isn't it amazing? The U.S. won't kick them out of NATO because, my God, Turkey's been part of American strategy all along for controlling the Black Sea region of NATO. Yeah, they probably can get away with it. But what an amazing thing for the BRICS countries. Remember who the BRICS are. That is Russia and China and India to start, and Brazil, South Africa, and now several more strategically important countries, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the Emirates. This is... No, not the Iran. Is it the Emirates? Oh my God! But
we get the picture though.
No. But yes, sorry about.
No, that's all right. But you're at heart an economist. You can tell us what this is going to do to the dollar.
Well, look, this is part of the point. What we have here is right now 10 countries that constitute about 36% of world output versus 29% of world output of the G7. That's the US, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan. You know, the BRICS are now larger than the G7 by a wide margin. The BRICS are about 46% of the world population. And what is absolutely stunning is dozens of countries are lining up to join the BRICS. Now, what this does mean, one of the motives right now is countries don't like the U.S. sanctions regime. What this means is the U.S. says, no, you can't do business with Russia. And they say, but, you know, it's none of your business. You're the United States, so we're India. We want to trade with Russia. No. If you do, we will sanction your banking system. And this has been the threat that the U.S. has for third countries that aren't party to the conflict in Ukraine, for example, that want to have relations with Russia, with other countries. But the U.S. thinks that it has the right to say which countries other countries trade with. And now, to come to the BRICS, the point is that the BRICS are going to make a non-dollar payment system. I've been involved in many discussions with these experts because this is one of my areas of expertise, is how payment systems and monetary systems work. There will be non-dollar payment systems at a much larger rate in the coming years. Already, Russia-India trade, for example, which the U.S. tries to stop, is booming without, of course, any role of the dollar whatsoever. And this will become a general proposition. It's going to accelerate. The U.S. will feel it because right now, the U.S. has what General de Gaulle, President de Gaulle of France, now 60 years ago, called America's exorbitant privilege, which is that because everybody uses the dollars, the U.S. gets to issue dollar credits without too much consequence. But if other countries aren't using dollars, we're going to have to tighten our belts, balance our budgets, do all those things Americans hate and Congress people hate even more, which is actually have a budget that makes sense. And this is what is coming. And the BRICS are going to be a huge motive force of that. And I think it's already, without a return. The U.S. has just confiscated the reserves of too many countries, interfered in too many other countries, meddled in too many countries. It's undermined the confidence in the dollar as a true means of payment rather than as a weapon of foreign policy.
Well, how about this? You dare trade with the Russians, and we will steal your president's jet.
Isn't it something? Of course,
unbelievable. The federal government sent FBI agents to steal a jet in the Dominican Republic because it was owned by and used by President Maduro of Venezuela, who trades with Russia.
Turkey is important to NATO, but how? Let me explain. Turkey joined NATO in 1952, and today is one of the most important members of NATO. The most important thing about Turkey is its location. Turkey is the only country in the NATO alliance that gives NATO access to the Middle Eastern countries and allows to maintain its influence in the region. Secondly, Turkey controls the Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles Strait, the only route from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. In case of conflict with Russia, the NATO alliance could easily eliminate Russian ships from this point and completely block Russia's maritime trade. Apart from this, Turkey is the country with the second largest army in NATO, which has been fighting for NATO's interests for the past several years. All these things make Turkey a valuable asset for NATO.
When Turkey joined NATO in 1952, it expected to be treated equally, just like the other member countries. However, in the 1970s, a major crisis occurred. Some people in Cyprus, with help from Greece, tried to take control of the island. To protect the Turkish Cypriots living there, Turkey invaded Cyprus. Even though both Greece and Turkey were NATO members, NATO supported Greece and imposed military sanctions on Turkey. Sadly, the organization that Turkey had once trusted betrayed it and intentionally sidelined it. In response, Turkey shut down all American military bases and stopped American flights from using Turkish airspace. But over time, without allies, Turkey struggled, and many expected it to fall in line. Instead, Turkey began strengthening ties with other nations, developed its own weapons, and focused on military self-reliance. By the 2000s, Turkey had built its own tanks, drones, and missiles. Even though it remained a NATO member, it no longer depended on America or any other country.
America is actually obligated to attack Israel under these military circumstances. Turkey has threatened to attack Israel. Israel responded by trying to get America to kick Turkey out of NATO. Remember, everybody, Turkey is part of NATO. America's part of NATO, a military alliance. Israel is not. An attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. If Israel attacks Turkey just the way they attack Lebanon, Syria, Iran, or everybody else, then under those circumstances, America is obligated by its military alliance to attack Israel. So that's why Israel's trying really hard to get Turkey out of NATO right now. But then it comes down to the question is, would America actually do that? I think that if Turkey and Israel went to war, America would actually break its military obligations with NATO and side with Israel just because that's how much influence Israel has on America.
Israel right now is terrified of Turkey and is asking the US to stop arms sales to Turkey to weaken their military. Now, President Trump recently authorized a major shipment of F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. And to respond to this, Benjamin Netanyahu told President Trump that he wants this deal to be rejected, pulled, and no more arms sales to Turkey, who is a NATO country. Now, Turkey is in a defensive alliance by treaty with the US, while Israel is in no such alliance on paper. But Israel doesn't care about that, and instead wants the US to simply abandon a NATO country because they feel a little threatened whenever Turkey has never attacked Israel in its existence of a government. This has to do with the president of Turkey, Erdoğan, who is a staunch anti-Israeli supporter. He's condemning the Palestinian invasion, condemning the Gaza war, and also condemning interactions in Lebanon and Iran. So when President Trump is authorizing a simple and standard fighter jet to Turkey, the Israeli government freaks out, calls Trump, and says, shut it down.
Israel's new enemy, Turkey. Now, in a very shocking turn of events, the president of Turkey said that Israel is responsible for all of Gaza falling apart, committing atrocities within Gaza. What's also interesting, though, is that the president of Turkey did say every country has the right to defend themselves. However, he pointed out that no one is keeping an eye on Israel and they are able to do whatever they want. Now, here is the fear that Turkey gets involved with this war, and if that happens, this is going to be a disaster. Mainly because almost all NATO allies support Israel, but if Turkey turns, this means NATO starts to fall apart. And Turkey already has very rocky relations with the rest of NATO. Now, Israel has begun to pull diplomats away from Turkey and back into Israel. There is an all-time threat right now for all Israeli citizens, let alone diplomats, especially in countries who throw threats at Israel like that.
The next target is not Iran anymore, it's Turkey. A senior Israeli political analyst, Yoni Ben Menachem, who's deeply linked with Israel's elite power circles, has openly declared what many feared. After Iran, Turkey is now in the crosshairs, and he's not vague. He said it loud and clear. Turkey is the next enemy. This isn't just random talk. It's a well-thought-out plan. According to Ben Menachem, Israel is preparing to isolate Turkey, remove it from NATO, and launch operations through Syria. The groundwork is being laid. Turkey, despite being NATO's second-largest army, is being surrounded diplomatically, militarily, and economically. The goal? A regime change. Complete destabilization. Why? Because Turkey supported Hamas indirectly. Because Turkey has military power. Because Turkey still holds political weight in the Muslim world. And that threatens Israel's broader Middle East strategy. But this goes even deeper. Israel knows NATO's Article 5 protects Turkey. So they plan to get Turkey kicked out of NATO first, using influence. Possibly with the help of U.S. political pressure, especially if someone like Trump returns and demands Turkey's removal in exchange for funding. Once that protection is gone, the pathway to direct or proxy attacks becomes open. The same script followed in Syria and Iraq is now being drafted for Turkey. The same Mossad-style infiltration that rocked Iran is now active inside Turkey. Agents, cyber attacks, internal sabotage, everything is already in motion. And the biggest weapon? Isolation. Who will help Turkey? Not NATO, not Iran, who is under attack itself, not Pakistan, who is being dragged into conflict with India. Qatar is also on the list. One by one, every Muslim power is being neutralized, strategically, silently, and systematically. Israel understands the psychology. Muslim nations may condemn, protest, maybe even chant on the streets. But they don't send armies. Gaza proved that. Iran proved that. Israel knows the maximum reaction is condemnation, and they're fine with that, as long as no one fights back. Turkey's economy is already bleeding. Inflation, currency crisis, tourism collapse. Add political destabilization and military tension, and the internal resistance will crumble faster. Ben Menachem hinted that winning Turkish hearts is essential for post-war control. Why say that? Because they plan to occupy, not just bomb, a ground presence, a political transformation, just like Syria. President Erdoğan saw this coming. He said if Hamas falls, Turkey is next. He wasn't wrong. The Israeli establishment is vocal now because they're confident that no one will come to help. Turkey either. The roadmap is clear. First isolate, then attack via proxies, launch cyber strikes, trigger economic collapse, and then go for the regime change. This is not speculation, it's declaration. But the question remains, who will stop it?
Turkey is not happy at all with Israel. Okay, the Turkish president is really not happy. And on Wednesday, Turkey sent warships to Lebanon. Why? Israeli soldiers have crossed into Lebanon physically. After bombing multiple times, looking for Hezbollah, they've decided to cross into Lebanon physically.
We are now in a Lebanese village, a Shia village in Lebanon. This village is one of the villages close to the Israeli border.
Could indicate Ankara's willingness to escalate its involvement in the regional violence against Israel.
Eventually, our borders will extend from Lebanon, the Great Desert, which is Saudi Arabia, and then from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates. And who's on the other side of the Euphrates? The Kurds. And the Kurds are our friends. So we have the Mediterranean behind us, the Kurds in front of us, Lebanon, which really needs the umbrella of protection of Israel. And then we're going to take, I believe we're going to take Mecca, Medina, and Mount Sinai and purify those places.
Leadership acting with the delirium of the promised land with a purely religious fanaticism will set its sight on a homeland after Palestine and Lebanon.